Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with part 2 of our video lecture on the English colonies in the 18th century. This one is going to be a little longer than the first part, so please settle in, make yourselves comfortable. Before we get back to the English colonies, I don't want us to forget the presence of other European colonizers in North America. So we talked about New France with their colonies of Canada and Louisiana. And you know from the reading we had from the Jesuit relations that even though the Jesuit missionaries were trying to change the Indians' religion and some of their customs, they didn't try to change all of the Indians' customs. They didn't really try to Europeanize them completely. And furthermore, among the French fur traders, there was a lot of intermarriage with Indian women in both Canada and Louisiana. And if you're trying to promote understanding between people of two different cultures, intermarriage may be the very best way to do that, because it gives people common goals, for instance, to take care of their children together. That really helps to bring two cultures together. And so we see that the French had the best relationship with the Indians of any of the colonizing powers. The Spanish, as you know from our lecture on Spanish exploration, really didn't start off so well in their relationships with the Indians, forcing them to labor, for example. There was sort of a turning point, though, that came in the Spanish colony of New Mexico, starting in 1680. A religious leader named Pope emerged among the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, and he believed that the Great Spirit, God, was telling him that it was time for the Pueblo Indians to rise up and rebel against the Spanish colonizers, which they did. And in fact, this was one of the very few Indian rebellions that was successful in North America, at least for a while. The Pueblo uprising succeeded in driving the Spanish out of New Mexico until 1696. But of course, the Spanish did not give up, and in 1696 they brought up an army from Mexico and reconquered New Mexico. However, in a way, the Spanish had really learned their lesson from Pope's rebellion, and their treatment of the Indians was much more humane, really, after they came back in 1696. They did not force the Indians to do nearly so much labor for them, and they were not quite as strict in terms of religion, trying to force the Indians to abandon all of their native religion and adopt Catholicism completely. So you could say that the Spanish took a kinder, gentler approach with the Indians after Pope's rebellion, and began to develop much better relationships. And also the Spanish did intermarry with the Indians quite a bit. So when the Spanish did begin to colonize California, Upper California, in 1769, they had a lot of success just by using their traditional approach of establishing mission settlements. You can still see the beautiful mission churches created by the Spanish missionaries up and down the California coast if you drive up the Pacific Coast Highway. And these missions were quite successful. So we can say that the French relationships with the Indians were good from the start. The Spanish relationships got better over time. But in the English colonies, things tended to go from bad to worse. And even when they started off very promisingly, they always eventually went sour. So the English definitely had the worst relationships with the Indians of all the European colonizing powers in North America. Okay, let's talk about the most famous American of the colonial period, Benjamin Franklin. Such an extraordinary figure in American history. Franklin was born to a relatively poor family in Boston. He was one of the youngest of 17 children. His father was a chandler. That means he was a candle maker. Um, so Franklin did not have a lot of formal education. He didn't really have a lot of advantages. His brother James Franklin, however, did become a newspaper publisher in Boston. And in 1721, the young Benjamin Franklin went to work for his brother at this paper called the New England Courant. And it was in the Courant that Franklin had his first published works. His brother refused to publish the articles that he wrote, and so he started writing articles under a pen name. He called himself Silence Dogood. This was a lady's name, so he was pretending to be a woman writing these articles and slipping them under the door of the newspaper office at night. And his brother loved the articles and printed them, not having any idea that these were written by his younger brother, Ben. Um, but eventually, Ben Franklin got tired of working with his older brother and decided to strike out and try to make his fortune on his own. So he got on a ship to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and in his autobiography, he talks about how he got off the boat with 1 penny in his pocket and immediately spent that 1 penny on a loaf of bread. But Franklin was smart. He was very, very ambitious, extremely hardworking, and so very soon he had his own newspaper in 1729 called the Pennsylvania Gazette. And then in 1732, he started publishing the series of books that really made him famous throughout the colonies, Poor Richard's Almanac. Now, you may be familiar, if any of you have a farming background, with an almanac. This is a book targeted at farmers. It contains weather information, predictions, advice about which crops are going to grow best in a given year, when to plant the crops, etc. But Franklin's Almanac was different. He wrote this under a pseudonym as well. He called himself Poor Richard. And Poor Richard was supposed to be this wise old farmer who had all of these wise sayings. And so Poor Richard's Almanac included such very famous sayings as early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And another one which you may have heard, Poor Richard said, there are only 2 things certain in life: death and taxes. So thanks to these sayings, a lot of people read Poor Richard's Almanac, and Franklin, it was widely known, even though he used a pen name, that he had written it, and so he became very famous throughout the colonies. I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a second and talk about another important newspaper editor who really struck a blow for freedom of speech in the colonies in 1734. In the colony of New York, John Peter Zenger, in his newspaper, published an article attacking the governor of New York, whose name was actually William Cosby. And so Zenger said that Cosby was corrupt, he was incompetent, he was taking bribes, and so forth. And in those days, you know, in the English Empire, free speech was very limited, and especially if you were speaking about a high government official, there were just certain things that you were not supposed to say. And so John Peter Zenger was arrested and charged with libeling Governor Cosby, and he was put on trial. But the jury found Zenger not guilty, because the jury said that everything Zenger had said about Cosby was absolutely true. And so Zenger was acquitted, and that really set a very important precedent for freedom of speech, freedom of the press in America, and helped to lead to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Well, back to Franklin. So from his headquarters in Philadelphia, Franklin accomplished many things. You're probably aware that he was an inventor. His famous experiment with the kite, with the key dangling from it, showed for the first time that lightning is actually electricity, and that experiment made him world famous as a scientist. He was also an inventor. He invented many things. The lightning rod to protect people's houses during thunderstorms. The Franklin stove, a new kind of wood-burning stove, and also the bifocal. Uh, he invented that, and many people, myself included, have Franklin to thank for that today. Franklin also helped to establish, in a way, the first press service throughout the colonies. He formed a network of printers and newspaper publishers throughout the colonies and got them to share stories and information with each other. And this was very significant in the run-up to the American Revolution, in helping the colonies to grow closer together to develop a more American identity, and to think of each other as being part of a common cause. In addition to newspapers, there were other factors that were emerging that were helping the colonists to become more closely linked, networked with each other. Men would still go to taverns, as they traditionally had done in England, in order to share information and news. But increasingly in towns and cities, there were coffee houses that were established as public places where people could go to discuss politics and current events. And usually coffee houses would subscribe to newspapers, so it was a place where if you couldn't afford a newspaper, you could go and get the news as well. And so in the run-up to the American Revolution, coffee houses as well as taverns were places where men, including important colonial leaders, could go to establish contacts and links with like-minded people who were concerned about the direction that the British Empire was taking. Another very important fraternal space for men was the Masonic Lodge. Okay, now you may be familiar with this. I've noticed since I moved here that Masonry is quite popular. Nowadays, Masonry, it's more or less a social club and a charity. You know, when you think of the Shriners and all the work they do for children, establishing hospitals, and so forth. In the colonial era, Masonic lodges were top secret societies where men would be initiated secretly, were sworn to secrecy about who was in the lodge. They would have secret handshakes and distress signals, because Masons were always supposed to help and support each other no matter what. They had secret symbols that were meaningful to them. If you look at the dollar bill, you'll see that there are some Masonic symbols on it. For example, the pyramid with the all-seeing eye of God hovering over it, that's a Masonic symbol. The reason it's on our money is that a number of important leaders in the American Revolution, the early Republic, were Masons. Men like Paul Revere, Benjamin Franklin was a very important high-level Mason, but especially George Washington was extremely active in Masonry, and it was Washington as the first president who brought that culture of Masonry, in a sense, into our public life. And this, there are a lot of internet rumors about this to this day. Practically all the presidents of the United States since Washington have been Masons, in fact, and so this has had a very important and much discussed influence on our national history. But for the purposes of this course, I just want to emphasize that Masonic lodges were a place where political leaders could network and find support. And when the revolution broke out, Masonic lodges became a very important place of resistance to the British Empire. And so, thanks to people like Franklin and the colonies, during the 50 years before the Revolution, printing, publishing of newspapers and books really increased dramatically in the colonies. In fact, between 1740 and 1770, the volume of printing in America doubled. And that, too, was very important in terms of getting political ideas and concepts out to the people and helping to inspire the revolution. All right, well, I want to talk about the changing profile of immigration in the English colonies in the 18th century. Now, during the 17th century, nearly all people who came to those colonies were from England, Scotland, and Wales, from the island of Great Britain. But in the 18th century, you start to see large numbers of people coming from other places in Europe. For example, in Pennsylvania, you see the influx of what people call the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, that's kind of a misnomer. Actually, the Pennsylvania Dutch were not Dutch. They were called that because the language they spoke was Deutsch, that is, German. These were actually Germans. A lot of them were religious refugees fleeing religious persecution in the different parts of Germany. People such as the fascinating group called the Mennonites, closely linked to the Amish. I'm sure you're familiar with the Amish lifestyle. They lead a very traditional farming way of life. The Amish do not use technology. They don't use farm machinery. They don't drive cars. The Mennonites today are a little more open to those things. They will drive cars, but they have to be black. And they have also clung to a more traditional viewpoint on life, trying to preserve their ancestral religious customs. The Amish and Mennonites are also pacifists, like the Quakers, and give a great witness for that as well. Another group, the Moravians, also known as the Pietists, came to Pennsylvania. Pietist, that means that they had a very heartfelt kind of religion. Their religion was based on a very personal relationship with Jesus, very deep, very emotional. In fact, there were some Moravians who came to Georgia in the early years after Georgia was settled, and while there they encountered a young man named John Wesley, who had come to Georgia in his first ministerial appointment. And John Wesley was so impressed by the Moravians that their beliefs really influenced him as he started the Methodist Church in England, which later, of course, spread to America. Also, you had some Lutherans and Catholics who came over to Pennsylvania from Germany. Like I said, Catholics were welcome in Pennsylvania, unlike most of the other colonies. Another really important and interesting group of immigrants were the Scots-Irish. Why were they called that? Well, their roots were in Scotland, but in the early 1600s, King James I had made them move over to Northern Ireland to help control that country for England and Scotland. But over time, these Scottish people in Northern Ireland experienced a lot of economic hardship and also some religious persecution. They were strict Calvinists, Presbyterians, and so when they came to America, they were the ones who established the first Presbyterian churches in America, and the Presbyterian churches that we know today really spring from this Scots-Irish movement. The Scots-Irish were kind of unique in that they were very tough people, very rugged, very warlike. They really didn't like being around lots of other people in towns and cities. So typically, when the Scots-Irish would arrive in America, they would not stay on the Atlantic coast. They would move to the mountains, head for the hills. So it was these Scots-Irish folk who actually settled the region you see on the map there, the Appalachian Mountains. They're in orange. And so they formed the nucleus of the kind of folk Appalachian culture that we think of today, for example, in connection with bluegrass or country music that really sprang from their ancestral ballads that they brought over with them from Ireland and originally from Scotland. So this group, the Scots-Irish, became a very, very important factor in America, and especially in that Appalachian Mountain region, reaching all the way down into Georgia and Alabama. All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about developments in the colony of Pennsylvania. So, William Penn had established that tradition of religious tolerance in Pennsylvania, and that was the reason why members of so many different religious groups were coming to Pennsylvania. And that was great, of course. You know, we tend to think of that kind of diversity nowadays as something very positive and enriching for a community. However, diversity can sometimes lead to problems in a society, especially where you have a large amount of immigration happening very rapidly from very different cultures. It can create problems, first of all, simply of communication, because the members of these groups spoke different languages. A lot of them did not speak English. Second, you have people with different political and especially religious beliefs who may not get along very well with each other. Third, you have members of these different groups competing for scarce resources. And so, in a way, the diversity in Pennsylvania helped, in the long run, to undermine, to some extent, Penn's original vision. Now, the Penn family, after the death of William Penn, his descendants actually left the Quaker Church and went back to the Church of England. And that put them in opposition to the Quakers in the Pennsylvania Assembly. And so two political parties formed in colonial Pennsylvania, the Quaker Party and the Proprietary Party, dominated by the Penn family. And the Penns really needed to have support, and so they approached the Scots-Irish settlers who had moved way out into western Pennsylvania on the frontier like they typically did. And they knew that the Scots-Irish frontiersmen were disgruntled because they felt that the Pennsylvania government was not doing enough to protect them from the Indians. This is similar to what happened in Virginia before Bacon's Rebellion. Now, they did have something of a point. There was a reason why the Quaker government of Pennsylvania could not really protect them. They were pacifists, after all. They didn't even really have a militia or a military group to protect the frontiersmen. And so the frontier people felt very vulnerable and exposed to Indian attack. Well, the Proprietary Party, the Penn family, approached them and said, look, if you support us in our party, we'll support you in your struggle with the Indians. And that political deal led to one of the most shameful events in colonial American history, which took place at Conestoga, Pennsylvania, in December of 1763. Knowing that they had political support now from the Proprietary Party, a group of Scots-Irish settlers known as the Paxton Boys rode into a peaceful village of Christian Indians at Conestoga and murdered 6 of them. And then the leaders, the white settler leaders in the area, moved the surviving Indians into a workhouse in Lancaster, Pennsylvania to try to protect them. But the Paxton Boys rode into Lancaster, dragged them out of the workhouse or poorhouse where they were being lodged, and killed 14 more of them as they begged for mercy. And I said this was a really shameful event. You know, these Indians had basically converted to Christianity. They had adopted European culture. They were very friendly to the English settlers, but essentially they had lost their Indian fighting qualities, and that made them helpless sitting ducks for an attack like this, which they really did not deserve. But it's very interesting that the Paxton Boys were never prosecuted, never put in jail for what they had done. And as a matter of fact, their allies in the Proprietary Party won the elections in Pennsylvania the following year, 1764, showing that by 1764 in Pennsylvania, most people seem to have forgotten that original dream of William Penn to have friendly and fair relationships between the settlers and the Indians. So in a way, Penn's vision of tolerance, which led to so much diversity so fast, including the arrival of the Scots-Irish, helped to undermine his vision of a peaceful relationship with the Indians. All right, turning to a different topic now, I want to talk about the great religious revival that we call the First Great Awakening in America. And by the late 1730s, we can say that the English colonists in America were ripe for this kind of revival. So, as you know, many of the colonies, especially the ones in New England, had been founded on religious principles. The goal was to create a godly society that would run according to the Bible, where people would treat each other like Christian brothers and sisters. But by the 1730s, many people had moved away from that original idea in order to pursue money. As the colonists became more prosperous and more wealthy, they tended to forget their original religious principles. And I think a lot of people really felt guilty about that and worried that maybe God would punish them for backsliding away from the very intense faith of their forefathers and foremothers. And so, like I said, the colonies were ripe for revival. The revival that we call the First Great Awakening was triggered by the arrival of an English minister named George Whitefield in America in 1739. Whitefield was a minister of the Church of England who went all through the English colonies, all 13 of them, preaching open-air revivals between 1739 and 1741. Now, to look at George Whitefield, you wouldn't think that he would be such a magnetic figure. He was kind of short, a little bit chubby, and if you look at this portrait of him, you see that he had what people would have considered a physical defect. He was cross-eyed. But when George Whitefield opened his mouth to preach, people were absolutely hypnotized. I mean, mesmerized and completely taken aback by his message. And Whitefield became a huge celebrity, almost like a rock star of today. And everywhere he went, huge crowds came out to hear him speak. So, for example, in Boston, which at that time was a fairly small town of about 15,000 people, when Whitefield preached on Boston Common, 20,000 people showed up. So you know they were coming from the countryside, from all over, just to hear this man preach. And so Whitefield provided the spark for a religious revival that engulfed the colonies that we call the First Great Awakening. And when people went to these revival meetings, they were looking for that typical revival experience of being born again, experiencing the new birth. In other words, receiving that assurance that you were definitely going to heaven, that you were definitely going to be saved. And for many people, Whitefield triggered the process that through many trials and tribulations and ups and downs eventually led them to that reassurance. Now, not everybody in the colonies was really on board with the revival approach. There were some conservative members of the churches who didn't like revivalism. They thought it was an overly emotional form of Christianity. They wanted something more traditional, more calm. Those people called themselves the Old Lights, and the New Lights were the people who went to the revivals, who were really interested in this new type of religious experience. And the distinction or the hostility between the Old Lights and the New Lights grew to the point that two major churches, the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, actually split. And for several decades, there were Old Light Presbyterian churches and New Light Presbyterian churches, Old Light Congregational churches, and New Light Congregational churches. By the way, the Congregational churches were the descendants of the old Puritan Congregational churches in New England. The New Lights tended to be more progressive and more dynamic, and they especially were good at using education to spread their message. So it was New Light revival Christians who founded the College of New Jersey, which we now call Princeton University, in 1746, as a place where ministers, New Light ministers, could be educated. And in fact, many ministers came out from Princeton and spread all over America, and then later even to areas on the frontier in Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, etc., taking this New Light style of revival religion with them. I really want to mention the very important role played by African American Christians in the first Great Awakening. I talked in the last lecture about some of the African spiritual traditions which black Christians had incorporated into their worship in their praise houses on the plantations. And a lot of those customs and practices really fit very well with the revival type of Christianity that was being spread throughout the awakening. And in fact, black Christians were welcomed, by and large, to revivals in the first Great Awakening. And you can imagine how appealing that must have been for them, not just spiritually, but to have a place, a revival meeting where they could go and actually be treated as equals, as sisters and brothers. That obviously was very attractive and very important for them. And so African American spiritual traditions really influenced the revivals, and in turn the black church, as it developed, was strongly influenced by the type of religion that was common during this first Great Awakening. I have to mention this. So a couple of years ago, I went to a conference in D.C. This was in January. It was very, very cold. My mom, who loves to travel, went with me. And on a break from the conference, we went to the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And in one of the rooms, I was so excited because there was the pulpit that George Whitefield carried with him during the first Great Awakening. So I'm such a geek, and I was so excited that I had to take a picture of it, and they yelled at me because you weren't supposed to take pictures in there. But there you have it. You see my mom there next to that very important piece of furniture that really touched off a religious revolution in the American colonies. And also, like Franklin's network of printers, the first Great Awakening was very important in terms of bringing the colonies together. This was an event that took place in all the colonies, and in that sense too, Whitefield and the Awakening helped to unite the colonies almost for the first time in a common American spiritual identity. All right, on to another topic. One of the many hats that Benjamin Franklin wore, in addition to being a printer, a scientist, an inventor, a publisher, a writer, Franklin was also what we call a demographer. That is, he studied population and population growth. And in the early 1750s, Franklin came out with a pamphlet in which he showed that the population of the English mainland colonies was doubling every 25 years. By 1750, it had already reached 2 million, and he predicted that by 1775 it would be 4 million, which actually came true. And this was really a phenomenal rate of population increase for the world at that time. When you think about all the diseases that there was no cure for, and the poor diet and malnutrition in many places and so forth, and high infant mortality and women dying in childbirth, that was very common throughout the world. This was just an astronomical rate of population increase. So why were people in America having so many babies? Well, one factor that we know of was that premarital sex was actually very much on the increase in the 18th century in the English colonies. How do we know that? Well, it's very easy. If you look at the marriage records, let's say, in a certain parish, and you see that there was a couple that got married in July of a certain year, and then you look at the birth records, the baptism records, and you see that they had a baby in November, well, you know that that couple was pregnant when they got married. And so the number of babies conceived out of wedlock, and also to some extent the number of babies born out of wedlock, increased dramatically during the 18th century. There's no doubt about that. Um, I wonder, there was this colonial courtship practice called bundling, and I wonder if this bundling custom might have had something to do with that. So bundling was a way, if you were a courting couple, that you could spend the night together supposedly without having sex. There were two methods of bundling. One was that you would be sewn into a big canvas sack that had a divider down the middle of it, so the man and the woman could not touch each other, but they were able to sleep together. The point of this, I guess, was just to see if they were compatible, you know, maybe if he snored or she ground her teeth or whatever. To sleep together. They weren't supposed to have relations with each other in these bundling experiments. But if you look at the second method of bundling here in the picture from Colonial Williamsburg, this just involved putting a wooden partition down the middle of the bed with him on one side and her on the other. And I don't know about you, but to me that would not be very effective as a method of contraception. And so I really think this bundling practice actually helped to increase the amount of premarital sex that was going on. Now, the difference between then and now, of course, is that in those days there was a big stigma attached to having a baby out of wedlock. So in nearly all cases, when the woman got pregnant, her boyfriend would marry her. And that meant that people were getting married very young. Typically, American women on the average were married in the colonies at the age of 20, and the typical American male was already married at the age of 22. And that meant that couples were together longer. They had a longer cycle of fertility where they could have more conceptions, more pregnancies, and more babies. In fact, the average American woman in the English colonies in the mid-1800s had 7 to 8 live births during her life. And when you think that some women were infertile, that meant that there were other women who probably were having 14 or 15 or more babies during their marriages. And so this really helped the population to grow at a remarkable rate. And what's really unusual in America was that this was true not only for whites, but also for African Americans, even for slaves. Okay? And that was very, very unusual. In most slave societies, African Americans did not replace their own population. The death rate was much higher than the birth rate in places like Brazil and Barbados and Trinidad. And so the European colonizers would have to bring over more and more Africans to those places to replace the slaves who were dying in very large numbers. It was only in the future United States that you start to see a trend that there are more births than deaths among the African American population, so that by the mid-18th century, most of the population growth in the African American community was not brought about by new slave imports, but rather by reproduction, by births. And that was highly, highly unusual among slave systems. What does that tell us? Well, uh, you know, slavery was horrible wherever you were. It was evil. It was terrible. Um, but it seems that there was some slight difference, perhaps, in the English American colonies compared to the Sugar Islands or the South American colonies. In terms, I mean, it could be in terms of quality of life. Perhaps the slaves were treated slightly better here. I wonder, though, if it might have had more to do with hope, with African American Christianity, with the hope that that instilled among the people, hope that they would someday be free, so that they were willing to have children, to bring children into the world. Because, you know, when people are hopeless, when they have no hope, they always find a way to not have babies. Um, but for whatever reason, African Americans in the future U.S. did have children, or they were willing to do that. Now, partly that had to do with the pressure they were under from their owners to have babies, because after all, when they did have children, that added to the wealth of the slave owner. But there may have been more to it than that, I think, and you know, it's a very interesting topic to think about. Um, all right, so I want to talk about the lead into the American Revolution in terms of economics. Actually, if you look at the English colonies during the 50 years before the Revolution broke out in 1775, it's interesting that actually it seems like the colonies are getting closer to England, not farther apart. And that had a lot to do with the prevailing economic theory of the time, which was called the mercantile theory, or the mercantile system, mercantilism. What was that? Well, according to this type of economics, every European power wanted to become completely self-sufficient, to grow and produce everything that they needed in their economy. And in order to do that, they had to get colonies to grow raw materials like sugar and cotton and tobacco. And then those items would be shipped back to the mother country. They would be processed, they would be manufactured into goods with the goal of total self-sufficiency, so that you wouldn't have to buy anything from any other country. And in that way, mercantile economists believed your country would grow richer. There would not be an outflow of money from your economy to other countries. But this whole idea of mercantilism meant that colonies became much more important in the great economic scheme of things. And the European governments, including England, began to take a much more active interest in what was going on in their colonies. We talked earlier about how the English colonies, a lot of them were almost totally unsupervised at the beginning by the English government, and really were able to fly under the radar. But with this mercantile idea, the government of England increasingly took a very strong interest in the colonies and became much more involved in the colonial governments. Oh, I want to mention before we leave this topic, the typical example of a mercantile trading system, what we call the triangular trade. Okay, so imagine a slave plantation on the English sugar island of Barbados, and you have the slaves there growing sugarcane, which was turned into what's called molasses. Some of you may have had this. You can still buy it in the store. I don't personally like it. My mom loves it. She likes it on her biscuits. But it's basically raw sugarcane. It's kind of bitter and not very sweet. It's a dark color, kind of a syrup. Well, anyway, the slaves were growing the molasses. The molasses was put onto ships that went to London or Liverpool, somewhere in England, or sometimes they would go to New England, to places like Boston, where the molasses would be turned into rum, an alcoholic beverage. And then the rum would be taken to the coast of West Africa, to English trading posts that were established on the West African coastline, and the rum would be exchanged for African slaves, who would then be brought back to Barbados to grow more sugarcane. So that was the triangular trade: molasses to rum to slaves. Notice that this is all taking place within the British Empire, and so it's a classic example of a mercantile type of trading structure. So as these goods were being shipped around the British Empire, of course the British government would impose trade duties, taxes on them, and the colonists really did not mind that. They called that kind of tax an external tax. And they understood that that was necessary for the regulation of trade. So the colonists really didn't object to external taxes on imported, exported goods. What they did object to were what they called internal taxes, such as property taxes or sales taxes. And most colonists did not think that the English Parliament or the English Crown had the right to impose these internal taxes on the colonies. Why? Because the colonies did not have any representatives in the British Parliament. They did elect representatives to their own colonial legislatures, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia or the General Court in Massachusetts. And so most colonists really believed that their own elected representatives in those colonial legislatures should be the ones to levy those kinds of taxes on them, not the British Parliament, where they had no representation. And so that was what gave rise to the very famous slogan that you learn, no doubt, in the lower grades: no taxation without representation. That became one of the rallying cries of the great tax revolt that we call the American Revolution. But in spite of the colonial objections to those kinds of taxes, still, the British government, in a way, got more involved in the colonies and their life. There were more royal colonies as some of the proprietary or corporate colonies became or came under the control of the British Crown. Also, wealthy Americans, people like George Washington or John Hancock or Thomas Jefferson or Robert Morris, were spending a lot of money on imported goods from England, things like tea and silver teapots and sugar and coffee and windows. Window glass was considered a very, very hot luxury item in those days. And so this led to what historians have sometimes called a consumer revolution in the colonies, as colonists tried to turn themselves into English gentlemen, to spend more money on luxury goods that would give them more status. Now, of course, as these white colonists improved their own status, we should not forget that a lot of this was taking place on the backs of slaves. After all of the wealth that men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had came from the exploited labor of their slaves, and a lot of the luxury items they were buying, like coffee and sugar, were being produced by slaves. So it's really a paradox or an irony that these luxury items that made the white colonists more self-confident and gave them more power and status came from the decline in power and status of their African American slaves. But increasingly, if you looked at the colonies before 1775, you might think that they were becoming more English rather than less. So how did the American Revolution come about then? Well, the roots of the American Revolution really are found in an earlier conflict that started in 1754 in America. Now, the French had come down from Canada, and they had built a fort in western Pennsylvania at a place where three rivers came together. We call that place today Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but the fort that the French built there was called Fort Duquesne. Now, the governor of Virginia heard about this, and he was very upset because actually Virginia had land claims in western Pennsylvania as well. And so the governor sent a young colonel of the Virginia militia up with an armed force to try to defeat the French and destroy Fort Duquesne, and that colonel's name was George Washington. So this was George Washington's first military expedition. It was a real embarrassment. It was a disaster. Washington was defeated by the French. He had to run back to Virginia with his tail between his legs. And it was this event that touched off the conflict that here in America we normally call the French and Indian War. And we call it that because on one side you had the English settlers, and on the other side, and as well as the British Army, and on the other side you had the French settlers, and nearly all of the Indians fought on the French side in the French and Indian War because, like we said earlier, the French and the Indians got along really well, and the English and the Indians really did not. So nearly all the Indians went to war on the French side, and so from the point of view of the English settlers, they called it the French and Indian War. In Europe, the war is known as the 7 Years' War because over there it didn't start till 1756, and it lasted for 7 years, so that's typically what they call it over there. Well, long story short, the English won the French and Indian War, and that caused a big upheaval in North America. France had to give up its colonies in North America. The English got Canada. Spain was given Louisiana by the French because Spain had helped the French during the war, so the French gave it to them as a kind of consolation prize or thank you for helping them. And the English also temporarily wound up with Florida. So the English possessions in North America grew pretty dramatically as a result of the French and Indian War. But as you can well imagine, the Indians in North America were very upset about this, about the departure of the French. They didn't trust the English. They didn't want to work with them. And in the Great Lakes region, there was a massive Indian uprising led by a chief named Pontiac. Of course, there's a car named after him today from Detroit. Pontiac was trying to defeat the English in hopes that the French would come back. And he was not successful in that, but for 3 years he did wreak havoc on the British settlements, captured a lot of British forts, and so forth. Pontiac's uprising led to an important development. In an attempt to win the Indians over and appease them, the king, George III, issued a proclamation, the Proclamation of 1763. And basically, the king drew a line on the map. You can see it there on the map, going down through the Appalachian Mountains. This is called the Proclamation Line. And what the king said was, look, English settlers, you are not allowed to settle west of this line. You must stay to the east of this line. All the land west of this line will belong to the Indians now and forevermore. So this was an attempt to reassure the Indians that the English government had good intentions by them. But it helped to really offend and upset a lot of the English colonists, some of whom had already bought land in those western areas or invested in land companies that were accumulating land back there, and they were very angry that they were no longer allowed to settle there. So that was one cause of the tension between the colonies and the English government. But the main reason for the rising tensions had to do with the Great War debt that the English government had accumulated, and it was really huge, about 60,000 British pounds sterling in debt the English government had incurred fighting the French and Indian War. Now, the British government very reasonably felt that the colonists should help to pay some of that bill. After all, they had fought the war, as they saw it, in order to protect the English colonists, so why shouldn't the colonists help to pay the bill? And so starting in 1765, the British government began trying to impose taxes on the colonies, which the colonists considered to be internal taxes, which they saw as illegal for the most part. The first attempt was known as the Stamp Act. It was passed by Parliament in 1765. Basically, this law required the colonists to buy a stamp for every type of paper product that they use. Books, newspapers, death certificates, marriage licenses, even packs of playing cards had to have this stamp on them, and the money from the purchase of the stamp, of course, went directly to the English government. Now, the Stamp Act really touched a nerve in the colonies, especially because of the taxing of newspapers that it involved. The colonists saw it as a real attack on freedom of speech, freedom of the press. They felt there was a conspiracy in the English government to deprive the colonists of their freedom as freeborn English people. And so the colonists organized themselves, and they used their power as consumers to fight back. They staged what we call a boycott. You're probably familiar with this term. Boycotts were used during the American Civil Rights Movement many years later. For example, the famous Montgomery bus boycott, when the black citizens of Montgomery, Alabama in 1954 refused to ride the city buses until they were integrated. So a boycott is when people get together and they refuse to buy something or to pay for a service until something is changed. And so basically the colonists organized themselves and said, we are not going to buy any English goods until the Stamp Act is removed. And what do you know? They were actually successful. The effect on the British economy of the boycott was so strong that British merchants pressured Parliament to cancel the Stamp Act, which they did. However, 2 years later, the British government tried again, passing a group of laws known as the Townshend Acts of 1767. These imposed taxes on various consumer items such as glass, lead, paper, tea, and paint. There was also quite a bit of resistance to the Townshend Acts. In fact, the British government had to send over several regiments of English troops in order to enforce and collect the tax. A couple of those regiments, about 1,000 troops, were stationed in the city of Boston. And the hostility between the Bostonians and these British redcoats, as they called them for their bright red jackets, resulted in the event known as the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, in which 5 residents of Boston were killed during a riot by English troops there in Boston. So this Boston Massacre really is a sign of the escalating hostility and tension between the colonies and the English government. And in the next lecture on the American Revolution, we'll talk about how those tensions exploded into open war in 1775.